Hello. Very recently, the Russian Alternative History Research Group, known by the name Laboratory for Alternative History, published their documentary on the findings they have made recently at the Turkish archaeological sites, and I decided to make something like a trailer in English, where I would show the main highlights for the benefit of those who do not understand Russian. Link to the original documentary is provided in the description of this video. Although the megaliths and other archaeological wonders that are currently found on the territory of nowadays Turkey is as rich that it can rival those of Egypt and Peru, most even mystery seekers are barely aware of them. Usually on the documentaries they show some sort of unreadable writing, and at most it culminates in a few Hittite bas-reliefs. And probably the only mysterious thing that they would know about is that for some magical unknown reason they decided, mainstream historians decided to date the site known as Göbekli Tepe as far as 12,000 years old. But what about the numerous high-tech machine marks on the Turkish megaliths? Omitting such an important, game-changing information creates a very misleading overall impression altogether, and it leads to irrelevant questions like how could those primitive people erect such amazing megaliths? Well, the people were not primitive, at least some of them were not, definitely. Amongst the so-called Hittite ruins, there are stones here and there that are so perfectly polished that upon examination with modern technology, what people find out is just a mirror-like surface. Even the very grains of which the stone consists are practically cut with a digital accuracy, and there is no trace of any instrument in this case, but such a result is not possible to achieve by any manual primitive stone polishing technique. And here is another piece of stone, just part of it somehow got broken off, and it clearly bears signs of advanced machine tools. This is how its surface looks like when magnified. This is definitely not a manual primitive masonry work. Only tools that we call advanced nowadays can leave such marks. And here is yet another perfectly polished stone, but on this one tool marks can be clearly noticed, those stripes, straight lines. But the remarkable thing observed on this stone is that most of the surface is just perfect, mirror-like and polished, and then all of a sudden the edge kind of gradually stops being worked on, and it's very interesting, the transition between the surface that has received treatment and the one that hasn't. If this was done with the tools that we have at our disposal nowadays, it would be clear until here the tool was touching the stone, and after a certain point there would be a visible boundary. While what we see on the Turkish stone is the tool marks, they gradually disappear. They just touch part of the stone and they don't touch other parts. This is quite strange, and the general expression of the expedition of Andrei Sklarov is that only half of the machine marks can be somehow attributed to tools similar at what we are familiar with nowadays. The rest is, so to say, beyond our level. Means we cannot even point out to any similar tool that we have that could have left certain marks that we see on the Turkish megaliths. Although we cannot find any tools in our toolbox that would do such a job, it seems the ancient Egyptians had them because on their megaliths there are very similar tool marks. This is one of the examples. The tool marks go in one direction, then all of a sudden they go in the other direction, and yet on the top it's kind of a primitive stonework. And the transition between them is kind of random. On the top right corner is just primitive chisel work. And we are back to Turkey now. The famous so-called Hittite lion gates also have here and there machine tool marks. And actually calling them Hittite is probably very far from the truth, because most of the civilizations that existed on the territory of nowadays Turkey historically don't even still have proper names, and they're put in this Hittite box for the simple lack of other names. I mean, even mainstream historians wonder who were the forefathers of the Hittites. Well, nobody. Somebody who made this polygonal masonry, it seems. This border on the royal or whatever lion gates crosses various stone blocks, and it really seems that it has been made after the stones have been placed already, which is a technique again widely used in Egypt and Peru. The group of Andrei Sklarov keeps returning to Turkey year after year, and this time there was a surprise. There was one more meter of excavation done by German archaeologists. And maybe they have been watching some of the videos of the laboratory for alternative history or something like that, because their attitude changed. This time they very carefully did not throw away together with the garbage pieces with machine marks on them, but very neatly placed them on the nearby stone as if to make them available to the group of Andrei Sklarov when they come next to examine them. And indeed, this is one of the pieces under magnification. The tool marks are just obvious. This time the research group brought with themselves portable optical microscope, and this helped them a lot to determine on the spot what were the tiny, very minute leftovers of the metal tool that was used, that was grinding these surfaces. And they were not surprised to find out that The tiny metal leftovers are very close to those that were found on the megaliths of Japan and Egypt. They found bronze-type alloys with unusually high content of iron, nickel, and cobalt. The amount of nickel and cobalt is much higher than the one that could have naturally occurred in case of contamination of ore or something like that. This type of alloys are used in the front age modern technology to increase the durability and strength of the super instruments, or at least the instruments that we call super. Besides the bronze alloy, another type of instrument has left its mark on the ancient megaliths, and that one has a high content of nickel and chrome. Again, something that we use in our most high-tech equipment. Manufacturing and handling similar compositions with primitive means, as it is depicted in this scene from the local Turkish museum, is absolutely impossible. Often in Turkey we find the situation very close to that of Peru. Megalithic wall and only segments of it are left, clearly visible polygonal masonry, but where it has been destroyed, it has been repaired in a really primitive manner with very rough stone work. At places in the so-called Hittite ruins, there are perfectly leveled platforms that are surrounded by, well, rocks that have been the natural gaps in them have been completed with megalithic walls. There seems there are no remains of any buildings on these platforms, and one gets the impression that there has been no intention of having such buildings altogether. It very much resembles few sites in South America. This is footage from Pisac, Peru. Same thing. Platforms with unknown usage surrounded by megalithic walls that follow the natural stones. This is a scene from a museum in Turkey depicting supposedly a primitive person creating one of these megaliths, but in reality it could depict a primitive person that has found an amazing creation left by the previous residents and is wondering how did they make it. There are two types of ruin in Hattusha. Some of them have high-tech megalithic polygonal masonry fundament base, which has been later on repaired and rebuilt somehow with primitive means, probably after its destruction, demolition. And the second type are again ruins that are completely done in a primitive way. And also one notices that those that have a megalithic base, they stand on surface that has been perfectly leveled beforehand, while the work that is done with primitive stones follows the natural curves of the terrain around. There are no clues at all. Why were these buildings erected at the first place? Definitely they were not residential quarters. No burials or everyday items have been found. They look like some sort of warehouses or some sort of industrial premises. God knows what was it there. They're automatically labeled, of course, as some sort of temples nowadays, but this shouldn't have any meaning to us because we know that archaeologists are advised, I mean professional archaeologists are advised during their study to put such labels anywhere they can on ancient sites. But what I said is more relevant for the structures that have an ancient, older megalithic base. Those that are more recent do bear some clues, and they simply look like some places for placing your domestic animals or storing your wheat, actually. Barns, this type of outbuildings. Near the complex of Hattusha, the archaeologists excavated a proper village where really primitive people lived. So that's where they lived. The complex was used for something else. Now let's visit an interesting Hittite fountain at the location called Eflantun Pinar. The bas-reliefs on its front side are definitely in what we call Hittite art style, but when one goes on the back side of this pile of enormous stones, here is the interesting stuff. It becomes clear that this is not the original place where these stones were meant to be. They were part of some sort of megalith that got demolished somehow or other, and this is their secondary use. The curves on the stone clearly show that they were part of a polygonal structure once upon a time. So in this case, the Hittites gathered together what they could find from the original megalith and made their own fountain, and after that they carved the depictions on the front. Now let's visit Alachahuyuk. A huge megalithic wall is found there, or at least poor remains of it, with clear signs of some sort of ancient restoration. They were trying, Hittites or whoever did it, they really tried this time to put the stones at their original place and not like in the case of the fountain where they put them as they could. So here in Lachahuyuk, one gets the feeling that one is in Peru, or at least the feeling that the same team of builders worked on the Peruvian megaliths and then came over. Maybe they landed on those platforms that were also Peruvian style and were actually landing places. That's why they were leveled and built something here. Although there is a Hittite style art on some of the blocks, it really seems that it has been added at a later stage. The art style of the original megalithic builders was the one of this lion, for example. And these sphinxes. And now in the vicinity here, the archaeologists claim that they are unearthing more buildings. However, in what they are what they're trying to cover with this whatever cloth or material on the top is that there isn't a single wall sticking anywhere. There are no buildings. It is just stones mixed with clay. They're simply using that loose stone as a building material, and they're building some sort of structures in the way they think it is okay. And no wonder that as a result we see perfect megalithic, even polished or high-tech cut blocks surrounded by very primitive ones, randomly. The question that immediately comes to mind is why the buildings that were there are in such condition. This is definitely not a result of earthquake, otherwise basically the ruins would be piled next to where they fell from, but this is not at all the case. They are in some sort of mixture of mud, and they are scattered all over the place. A further clue is the kind of crater formation exactly where this complex was. It's the diameter of this crater is some 45-50 meters. Did some meteorite fall over there? Well, I would find it hard to believe that all these meteorites are so intelligent that they always aimed at the megalithic structures, because such craters are visible near many similar megalithic sites. This is how the actual remains of the ruins looks like. There are no walls anymore, just a mass of material, and all the structures that you see are modern creation of the restoration teams. Now let's have a look at some strange objects that were found in the so-called royal tombs. There are resemblance to the modern high-tech mesh antennas is quite remarkable. And I wouldn't hurry so much to classify them easily as cult items for religious worship. An interesting piece of history is exhibited in the local museum amongst other, well, not other, but amongst cups and plates. Hardly we could classify it as a plate itself. It's only round, that's why it is in this section, but the main point is that this is made of obsidian. This is very difficult to work with, and the machine tool marks are very clearly visible on the object, and also its very quality speaks for itself. You cannot obtain such result with primitive means. And again, very similar to other obsidian objects from the museums in Mexico. Look at them, they look so technological, and again, this result cannot be obtained by some primitive hillbillies banging their heads with stones and sticks. Next to the so-called plate in Turkey, they have placed another really primitive plate. This is it, as if for contrast, to show the people what you can make by hand. This is what you can make by hand, and below it you see the machine work. Now let's go to Alalah, southern Turkey, at another supposedly Hittite archaeological site. Yet another interesting stone can be observed amongst the other ruins. Well, hardly any need of comment. Even non-specialists will notice that these are machine marks. Not only we see Peruvian style megaliths on the territory of nowadays Turkey, but the parallels are endless. For example, the elongated skulls of Peru are present here also in the Turkish museums as well. And now we are off to the famous Göbekli Tepe. I'm saying famous because many people have heard of it. Why? Because the mainstream historians have decided to date it as far as 12,000 years old. But on the basis of what? Since the current mainstream history doesn't have any accurate dating method at its disposal. I have a full-length video on my channel on the subject of the validity and accuracy of all dating methods. Please check it out. So basically this number 12,000 comes purely from the realm of wild fantasy, and the other part of the fairy tale that it was constructed by some hunter-gatherers who were picking berries and rhizomes from the forest and had no experience with building anything or having any tools at all, or culture or civilization as such. So all of a sudden they started erecting these huge stones much higher than themselves, and depicting on them prehistoric animals that should have died millions of years ago. Strange. Now this must be coming from the realm of silly jokes. And while telling us fairy tales, they don't seem to notice some basics that professionals should be noticing immediately, like for example, two distinctly absolutely different building styles on Göbekli Tepe. The tall columns, the huge stone slabs, bear completely different style altogether. I mean, the other stones are just raw and there is no carving at them. The contrast is obvious even to non-professional, and yet the penguins assure us that that everything belonged to one single culture. Well, it definitely seems that it has two layers to it. And the older layer is definitely the more advanced one, because in many cases the top more primitive layer goes around the advanced layer. Our attention is being distracted by descriptions that tell us that the big pillars were placed there to support the primitive wall, but in many cases the wall goes besides the columns, so they don't have any supportive function at all. And yet in many other cases the wall doesn't even touch this tall original primeval stone slabs. At places, the primitive wall is placed in such a way that it covers partially or completely the carvings on the big stones. This is yet another clue that actually the primitive wall was not a part of the original design, and it was only added at a later stage. And by the way, this is a very common phenomena for the megalithic structures, not only on the territory of nowadays Turkey, but it's a worldwide phenomena. Always the more advanced high-tech stuff is on the lower layers, and the primitive stuff is on the top. And here is another very interesting point. It is not a secret, everybody knows, that Göbekli Tepe was covered under a thick layer of clay mixed with stones. In other words, it really looks like the event that we know under the name as the Great Flood or the Global Deluge or whatever name you wish to use. Well, at least one of those events happened on the top of the existing site when the site already existed. That's why it is buried under it. Well, we would generally expect this to happen to high-tech relatively, high-tech things like the taller slabs in Göbekli Tepe. Usually the alternative view is that it is normal that they would be buried under the deluge, but here we see that even the primitive walls that were erected at a later stage on the top of the existing site of the megalithic slabs, even they were buried under this deluge or worldwide flood. So that raises many questions. When did this flood occur after all? And this primitive stonework is fully consistent to what is usually classified under the Hittite pile of things. They stamp everything as Hittite when they don't know what to do with it, because they don't want to create new words for the other civilizations that existed on the territory of nowadays Turkey. They don't want us to know that even such civilizations existed. That's why they prefer to put it all in the Hittite pile. And the full overall situation with these Turkish megaliths and arts and all these similarities with the culture of ancient Peru and Egypt as well, and to some extent even Japan, makes us question the full model of history that is currently prevalent and believed in nowadays society, according to which cultures that were geographically near to each other must have been similar, because in the antiquity people were hillbillies, dumb, they couldn't travel great distances, they had no technology, so they could borrow ideas only from their immediate neighbors. And that's what they did, at least that's what we are being assured by the mainstream historians. However, the archaeological sites show a completely different story. Cultures that were on different continents and supposedly existed in completely different periods of time, they show remarkable similarities that go beyond the possibility of just pure chance. So this is one reminder. It's time to wake up and start inquiring into our true history. Instead of being lazy and remain satisfied with the bedtime stories that we found in our history school books. There are all kinds of fairy tales over there, and their main purpose seems to be to convince us that the penguins have it all figured out and the history of our planet is more or less known. Well, with a few small exceptions, few small white spots that will be surely also discovered with the due course of time and our so-called advancement. New chapters are being continuously added to those fairy tale stories, and seemingly they confirm the full picture, but it seems that that's their only purpose of creation, to confirm the full imaginary story. Just a very recent example of such additional chapters are based on the sites of Çatalhöyük and Çayönü-Tepesi. New stories are starting to emerging that there was some sort of communist-like society at those times, and further wild fantasies. And what is the basis of all this? One of the sites consists of basically few primitive walls sticking out of the ground, as you see it here, without any further excavations or any clues what are these buildings altogether, just pure fantasy, in other words. And the other one, Çatalhöyük, they found houses very strange. There were a burial in every house, and there were no streets in the village. They are telling us that people were moving only on the roofs, and very strange. All the houses seemed the same. And on the basis of that, they are telling us stories about communism. While in reality, this was simply burial grounds. In nowadays Cairo, there is such a quarter called the Dead Town, and over there you see those very same houses. They all look the same. They are one or two storied, but no living people reside there. It is just burials on the first floor, and on the second floor sometimes the relatives come and leave some sort of small offerings and food and small household items, whatever they want to leave for the dead, and that's it. And the houses there look exactly like in that supposedly communist village, ancient communist village. And that fully fits with the archaeological findings. Then you really don't need any streets in between the houses, because there is no need of them, and very few household items and few bowls were found, just very few, but that's normal because somebody was coming sometimes and leaving some sort of offerings over there. And in the very vicinity of this basically cemetery, another proper village was found with normal houses and streets and barns and everything else. So instead of informing people about the amazing megaliths of Turkey, they are distracting their attention with talks about communism based on some cemetery of a small village. In this first episode, I briefly touched only on one of the numerous faces of the amazing heritage that we have in Turkey. And in the second episode will be the really interesting stuff.